I remember the scent of rosemary burning in the corner of the room as I clutched my newborn child to my chest. My sister stood beside my bed, her hands too cold, her smile too sweet. Darius wasn't far, he never was. I had loved him. Or thought I did. I had given up everything for him. And she, my own sister, Alira, had watched me do it. Had handed me the cup of tea that turned my limbs to stone. I died slowly. Not from blood or blade, but from the betrayal that crept into my bones. They didn't want me gone out of rage, they wanted my land. My name. My lineage. Our parents were nobles, but our bloodlines weren't equal. I had been the chosen heir to half of our father's estate. When I fell pregnant, I became a threat. They whispered to my father that I was fragile, that the burden of estate should fall to the more reasonable sibling. I didn't see the papers he signed while I slept. But Alira did. The plan was precise. Darius played the doting partner. Alira was the quiet shadow. The poison was slow, measured. Enough to dim the senses, not enough to be suspected. I was sick often in the final weeks. Numb, distant. But my instincts screamed. I remember lying awake, the child inside me kicking and feeling eyes on me that did not belong to love. Alira sat at my bedside often, pretending concern. Her hands cold, always cold. She would brush my hair and whisper, "You must rest." And when she brought the tea, her fingers trembled just enough to seem tender. But it was calculation. She had been planning for years. They knew my child would seal my inheritance. A son, the legal heir. And so they watched, waited, ensured my end came slowly, just slow enough that I could see them flourish in my stead. I went into labor alone. Darius had urgent business. Alira stayed, humming a lullaby that wasn't hers. My screams filled the chamber, but no one answered. When he was born, I held him. He didn't cry. Alira took him. Said she'd call for the wet nurse. But she never returned. I tried to stand. The pain was a fire in my spine. I collapsed beside the bed. It was raining that night. I heard the thunder. I remember thinking, this is how storms end. Not with lightning, but with silence. My last breath was soft. A whisper lost beneath the wind. And then, darkness. But it wasn't the kind of darkness that consumes. It was the kind that waits. I thought that was the end. But it was only the beginning. I awoke with breath in my chest and fire in my blood. Younger. Stronger. And this time, I would not be their prey. The day was the same. The morning of the husband choosing. The scent of my mother's perfume still lingered in the hallway. My sister's laughter echoed through the stone corridors. The servants moved in rhythms I remembered too well. But I moved differently. My steps were slower, heavier, purposeful. I had died once, and now I had returned. And this time, I would not die quietly. They would learn. I remember everything. It began with a whisper beneath my ribs. A warning, one I didn't need. I knew what day it was. I had died before it. And now I had returned to rewrite it. The morning light spilled across the marbled floor like gold trying to forgive blood. My mother called for us to dress. Alira was already humming down the hallway, her silken slippers tapping like the claws of a cat on polished stone. She didn't know. Of course she didn't. To her, it was still the day she would stand radiant before our family, pretending innocence while plotting theft. But I was not the same girl who once smiled nervously in this dress. No. I was the girl who had watched her sister steal her son. I was the woman who had screamed for help and heard only silence. They chose my husband that day. But this time I would choose mine. And I would choose vengeance dressed as love. My handmaid braided my hair, unaware that with each loop, she was tying back the grief of another lifetime. I stared at myself in the mirror. My face, so young again. My body, whole again. My voice, mine again. The same lips they once silenced would now sing their undoing. Downstairs, the hall had been arranged with royal precision. Our father, seated in his ceremonial robe, nodded to each noble guest who entered with gifts and intentions. My mother, always graceful, whispered judgments behind her fan. The suitors stood in a row like war trophies, shined, dressed, but empty inside. Elira stood with her chin high. She had always been beautiful, but today she wore the glow of someone convinced she was about to win. Darius was already among the guests, speaking with my father. It was the same as before. Except me. I walked into the room slowly. All eyes turned. And then I did something no one expected. I curtsied. But not to my father. Not to the noblemen lined like pawns. I turned to the guest in the far corner. A man they whispered about. The one from the east. Kale, they said. A veteran of the last war. Scars on his hands. Fire in his eyes. No titles. No land. And I pointed. I choose him. The room fell into stunned silence. Elira blinked. My father's voice was the first to break. You? What did you say? I repeated it. I choose him. The soldier. My mother stood, her voice brittle. You cannot, he's not on the list. Then make a new list, I said. Elira's smile cracked. She stepped forward, voice soft and poisonous. Sister, surely you jest. That man, he is nothing. I looked at her fully then. I saw the ghost of my child in her arms. I saw the ink on the stolen inheritance. I saw the blade that never came. He is something you will never have, I whispered. Honor. Kale stepped forward, his eyes searching mine. He did not know me, but I knew him. I had read his name in the scrolls during my first life. I had heard of the villages he protected, of how he walked away from power because he would not harm the innocent. He was the opposite of Darius. He was the blade I would choose to hold. And the shield I never had. The silence after my declaration lasted too long. Whispers grew into murmurs, then into low protests. I held my ground. My father stood now, his expression unreadable, torn between honor and pride, duty and disbelief. You disgrace the house, he said at last. You would throw away alliances for what emotion? No, I replied. For freedom. The fire in Kale's eyes didn't waver. He stepped forward and bowed, not as a man desperate for a title, but as one honoring strength. If she chooses me, I will not dishonor her name. My mother's face was pale. Elira trembled behind her fan. I saw Darius clench his jaw. Let them squirm. Let them feel what I felt, helplessness wrapped in silk. This time I was not the lamb. This time I had chosen the wolf. Kale and I were married within the week. My parents protested, of course, but not for long. Father feared scandal, yet feared my resolve more. And perhaps some hidden part of him, some weary corner of an old warrior's heart, respected the girl who dared defy tradition to claim her life. Mother said little. She always said little when her pride was wounded. Elira said even less. The day of the wedding, she wore a red dress, though she wasn't the bride. Darius stood beside her, feigning polite disinterest, but his eyes flicked to me too often, his jaw too tight. He had expected to win again. He did not yet understand, this wasn't the same game. I was no longer a pawn. Kale didn't speak much, either. But when he did, his voice held the gravity of someone who had seen death and returned with his soul intact. During the ceremony, he looked at me not with hunger, not with pride, but with a quiet understanding, as if he knew I had chosen him not just for his strength, but for his silence. For the way he didn't demand the spotlight, but stood firm in its edge. I had read of him in the journals. In my past life, I had pored over stories of the war while Darius slept beside me, unknowing that I was seeking a way out. I remembered the tale of the Eastern outpost, how a single soldier held back raiders for 3 nights to protect a village. That soldier had been Kale. He had no surname worth legacy, no estate, no noble blood, just honor and steel. We left the manor for a quieter village by the northern cliffs. A cottage Kale had rebuilt with his own hands during recovery. It overlooked the sea, wild and gray, just like the storm that had taken my life. He never asked me why I chose him, and I never told him. But he saw the pain in my eyes each time I flinched at a shadow. He did not press when I walked the cliffs alone, whispering to the wind. He simply stayed, built, waited, and slowly I began to breathe again. Months passed. Alira sent letters. Flowery, artificial letters. Pretending sisterhood. Pretending she hadn't killed me in another life. I responded once with a single sentence, "You are welcome to the man you stole." She never wrote again. But I knew. The plan was blooming. Just as before. In my first life, Alira and Darius had convinced my father to give them partial control of the western lands, my lands. Lands I had nurtured. I remembered their false concern, how they claimed I was too sickly to manage them. And when I died, those lands were signed fully over. My son, had he survived, would have inherited nothing. But this time I held the deeds. Quietly. I had made arrangements the day after our wedding. Cale, despite his aversion to politics, helped me draft the agreements. I had learned not to trust charm. I now trusted documents. Paper, after all, could be deadlier than poison. Word spread through the court like fire in dry grass. The older daughter, married to a war-scarred stranger, had locked down the family's richest land with a soldier's seal. Alira burned from the inside. I could feel it. And so did Darius. They hosted a banquet. An invitation was sent. A formal one, as if we were all still nobles pretending to smile. Cale saw my hesitation. He took my hand. "We go," he said. Not because he craved vengeance, but because he understood that sometimes healing comes from walking through the fire again, just to prove you can. We arrived in silence. The hall had changed little. The drapes were newer. The wine was richer. But the air still reeked of secrets. Alira greeted me with practiced joy. "Sister, you look healthy." I kissed her cheek. "I'm alive." She blinked. Darius flinched. Cale stood behind me like a mountain. Still. Solid. The evening passed in glittering tension. Conversations danced around legacies, inheritances, alliances. Darius was quieter now. He watched Cale closely. Perhaps he sensed that this time, the man beside me was not a puppet. Not a partner in crime. But a storm contained in human form. They tried to bait me. Small insults hidden in compliments. Half-truths disguised as gossip. I simply smiled. The final toast was to the family legacy. Alira raised her glass. To the next generation of strength and unity. And I replied, voice soft. To the ones who buried me before I could bloom. Her hand trembled. I let it. This time, I would not raise a sword. I was the sword. The morning after the banquet, I stood on the cliffs again. Salt spray on my face. The wind tangling in my hair like fingers of ghosts that once tried to choke me. I had faced them now, Alira, Darius, the family that smiled with fangs. And I had walked out untouched. But inside, I trembled. Cale found me barefoot in the wet grass, wrapped in the shawl his mother had woven before she died. He didn't speak. Just offered a cup of warm tea and sat beside me, letting the silence speak what words could not. I thought I would feel powerful, I whispered. Seeing them squirm. Seeing her hand tremble. And you didn't? He asked softly. I only felt tired. He nodded. That's what happens when you start healing. We lived simply. But there was peace in that simplicity. And yet, I knew it could not last. Not while Alira and Darius still circled the court like vultures. Not while they schemed with gold-tongued advisors to undermine my land rights. Not while they smiled in public and plotted behind oak doors. So I planned. I spent my mornings walking the cliff paths and my afternoons reading law books Cale found in the city. At night, by the firelight, we spoke of boundaries, of lines drawn not with ink but with blood. Cale sharpened his knives while I sharpened my mind. They would come for me again. Not with daggers this time, but with whispers. With forged documents. With old debts suddenly remembered. But I was ready. The first blow came quietly. A messenger with a decree, a request for oversight on the western lands, citing familial concern. It bore my father's seal. Cale watched me read it. I didn't flinch. "Do we fight?" he asked. "No," I said. "We starve them." I cut the trade lines that had once fed Alira's estate, citing mismanagement. Redirected grain shipments southward. Invested in roadwork through a small village she had long ignored. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I simply shifted the weight of power. By midsummer, rumors spread that the golden couple, Alira and Darius, were losing favor. That the land they boasted of had gone dry. That the people whispered a new name, Lady of the Cliffs. I had never wanted power, but I had needed it to protect what had once been stolen. To ensure my child, when he came, would never cry alone in a cold tower again. One evening I sat beside Cale, watching him oil the wood of the old gate. I placed my hand over his. "I'm pregnant." He froze, then smiled. Not the smile of conquest, but the quiet smile of a man who had planted seeds in ruin and seen them bloom. We didn't celebrate loudly. There were no trumpets, no feasts. Just an extra log on the fire, an extra layer on the bed, a soft lullaby hummed in the wind. And yet, in the manor far behind us, Alira shattered a glass when she heard. She knew. She remembered. That in another life, she had killed me the day I gave birth. And now I had given life again. And this time, I would not die. The days grew longer, and my belly with them. My body bloomed with life, and so did my land. The fields whispered in gold, the cliffs wore green like a crown, and the villagers smiled when they saw me pass. They called me Lady of the Cliffs now, and not with derision. With reverence. But with every smile came a shadow. A memory. The night I bled out alone in a tower with only betrayal at my bedside. The pain had never truly left me. It pulsed with each heartbeat. But now it was different. Now it pulsed with purpose. Alira sent another letter. This one shorter. More desperate. "Come home. Let's speak. For the sake of family." I burned it without reading the rest. Home? My home had been bled out of me the day she held my hand as I died. The day she kissed my forehead and whispered lies while my son was taken. Cale watched the flames rise from the hearth, his eyes reflecting amber and steel. "You'll have to face her," he said. "I know. When the time is right." And it came. Like all things do. Quiet, inevitable, uninvited. News reached our cottage that the western border was under dispute. A new decree had been filed claiming rightful succession of land from my dowry. It came not from my father, but from Alira herself. Brazen, reckless, desperate. She had overplayed her hand. I traveled back to the city. This time, not in chains, not in shame. I wore deep emerald and rode a black mare, and behind me followed Cale, silent and proud. I no longer crept into my old world, I strode into it. The court chamber was colder than I remembered. Or perhaps I had grown warmer in the sun. Alira stood beside Darius, her face pale, but her chin high. She had always been good at masks. "Sister," she said. "Don't call me that." Her lips trembled. "We're here to settle a legal matter," I continued. "Let's proceed." I presented every document, every charter, every clause she had overlooked in her arrogance. Cale stood at my side as witness and husband. The nobles watched in silence as the woman they once called meek dismantled the golden heir. When it was over, the ruling was clear. All lands were mine. Legally. Permanently. Darius stormed out before the final words were spoken. Alira remained. Frozen. Alone. I walked past her. But I stopped at the doorway. "You should have killed me properly," I said. Her eyes widened. "And you should have saved my son." I left her there. In the months that followed, her estate crumbled. The debts she'd hidden surfaced. The friends she'd bought vanished. And Darius? He returned to the sea, where liars often drown in their own myths. I gave birth in the spring. It was raining that day, but the skies cleared as he arrived. A son, just as before. But this time, he came into warmth, into love, into safety. Kale held him before I did. And I wept. For what was lost. For what was reclaimed. Motherhood was different this time. No nurses with trembling hands. No cold stone walls. No whispers outside a locked door. Kale built the cradle with his own hands. Rough, strong hands that had once held swords now shaped wood with gentleness. I watched him in the mornings, the sun catching in the scars on his arms, and I wondered how the world had convinced me for so long that love had to be soft to be kind. It didn't. Love could be fierce. Love could bleed. And love, when true, always protected. Iron's cries filled our small home with life. His laughter, rare but whole, echoed off the beams like a song I had longed to hear for lifetimes. Sometimes I would hold him and just weep. Not because I was sad, but because I had once died before I could do this. Kale was quiet, but present. Always watching. Always nearby. When I woke in the night from dreams of drowning in blood, he would rise before I even spoke, lighting the lantern and holding me until the fear ebbed. "You're safe now," he'd whisper. Safe. The word tasted new on my tongue. But peace never lasted. Not in stories like mine. One morning, as I carried Iron through the market, whispers chased us like flies. "She's back again. Alira. At the estate. Alone. Alone." That word meant more than they knew. Kale waited until Iron was asleep before speaking. "You need to go." "Why?" "Because what's unfinished will always follow you." So I went. To the ruins of the place I once called home. Alira had returned. But she wasn't the golden girl anymore. Her hair hung limp, her dress frayed. She looked older than our mother had ever been. She waited for me on the balcony, where once we had braided each other's hair and spoken of princes. "I wanted to hate you," she said. I said nothing. I married him because I thought it would give me your light. But it never did. He didn't love me. Not really. And I was always afraid you'd return. I did. You took everything. "No," I said. "You gave it away when you chose him over me." She looked at me then, not with venom, but with grief. "I lost a sister." I placed a small velvet bundle on the table. Inside, her mother's necklace. The one she had always coveted. "You lost her the day you watched her die," I said. "But I found myself. And I found love. That's the difference." She didn't cry. She didn't beg. But when I turned to leave, she didn't follow either. I returned to my cottage with a silence wrapped around me like armor. Kale met me at the door. Iron in his arms. Did it help? "No," I said. But it ended something. Later that night, as the fire dimmed, I held Iron close and whispered stories not of dragons or crowns, but of truth. Of strength. Of the kind of woman I hoped he'd one day know and never fear. And when Kale placed his hand over mine, our son between us, I knew. This was the life I had fought for. This was the life they tried to kill. But I was still here. Alive. And rising. We named him Iron. It means reborn. The first spring I spent as a wife, a mother, and a victor came with blossoms that covered the hills like soft snowfall. There was something sacred in how they fell, petal by petal, like the earth was letting go of a memory. I walked through those blossoms with Iron strapped to my back and Kale at my side. We spoke little, but we didn't need to. The peace we shared had weight. Depth. It filled the silence between us like roots anchoring the present to something unshakable. Villagers bowed as we passed, not out of fear, but out of respect. The girl they once thought ruined had become a woman they couldn't break. Still, shadows lingered. Rumors stirred from the east. Whispers that Darius had returned, without gold, without land, and without Alira. It didn't surprise me. She had vanished months ago, leaving behind only a letter Kale found in the rain, half blurred by water. I thought I wanted to be loved. But what I really wanted was to be you. Guilt was a ghost that never slept. Kale burned the letter before I could speak. "She doesn't deserve your breath," he said. And maybe he was right. But I did think of her sometimes. Of the girl I once braided hair with. Of the laughter before the lies. And I wept, not for what I had lost, but for what she had become. I began to write again. At first, it was only letters sealed with wax, sent to other women in nearby towns. Survivors like me. Some had lost sons. Others had lost names. All had lost their voices. I wrote to them because I remembered what it was like to die in silence. The cottage became more than a home. It became a haven. A place for women who had no one else. They came barefoot, hungry, scarred. But they left standing. Kale never questioned it. He simply built more rooms. Iron grew. And with him, my heart. He asked questions with wide eyes and a serious brow, why the sky changed colors, why the moon followed us home. And once, he asked, "Did you always want me?" My throat closed. I sat him on my lap and whispered, "I wanted you before I even knew what wanting meant." He smiled, satisfied. One night, a woman arrived at the gate, her cloak torn, her eyes wild. Behind her, a girl, no older than 10, clung to her waist. She had the same eyes as Alira. She didn't say her name, but I knew. Blood recognizes blood. I gave them a room. In the dark, Kale sat beside me. "You don't owe them anything." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I once needed saving and no one came." He took my hand. "You saved yourself." "No," I said. "I chose to live." "But Kale, you gave me something to live for." The fire crackled. Iron snored softly in the next room. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the war, my war, was over. I had been reborn in blood. But I lived in blossoms. And this, finally, was peace. It was a quiet morning when I found Alira's ribbon under a stone near the gate. Torn, weathered, but unmistakably hers. That crimson silk, it had been her signature once, her vanity wrapped in elegance. To most, it would be meaningless. To me, it was a signal. A whisper of unfinished business. I tucked it away. Not out of sentiment. Out of understanding. Alira was alive. And she was nearby. That night, Kale held me tighter than usual. As though he could sense the shift in the air. "You're not going back into war," he said, voice rough from sleep. "I'm not," I said. But she might be walking toward it. Iron was growing, more like Kale every day. Steady, wide-eyed, thoughtful. He asked fewer questions now and listened more. At times, I felt he saw the ghosts in me. And when I caught him watching, I smiled, reminding both of us that I was here. Alive. Still. The following week, the village elder came to me with a scroll. It was official. Alira had sold her last inheritance, the last trace of our family's ancestral estate, to pay off the debts Darius left behind. She was, in every way, exiled. "She's asking for refuge," the elder said. "Here." I laughed. Not out of cruelty. Out of disbelief. "Give her what she gave me," I said. And he understood. But Kale did not. He watched me as I stared at the scroll, eyes unreadable. "You still love her, don't you?" "No," I whispered. "But I grieve the part of me that once did." Alira never came. Instead, one rainy morning, a young man, barely a man, arrived at our gate. His coat was drenched, his hair matted, but his eyes, they were Darius's. He handed me a letter. "She's dying," it said. No names. No signature. Just 2 words. Kale saw the tension in my hands as I crumpled it. "You don't have to go." "I know. But you want to." I didn't answer. The next dawn, I stood at the edge of the woods with the letter still in my palm. Kale joined me, silent. Behind us, Iron played with the other children, unaware. "She took everything," Kale said. "Your name. Your blood. Your child." "And I took it all back," I said. "But she's still drowning." He nodded. "Then throw her the rope. Just don't jump in with her." So I went. Alone. Alira was in a convent, far from any town. The sisters greeted me with kindness. They knew who I was, and who she had been. She speaks only of you, one whispered. And her son. I entered the room. She was a shadow now. Skin clinging to bones. Eyes sunken. Yet she smiled when she saw me. You came, she croaked. I did. Why? Because once, you were my sister. She wept. I was so afraid you'd live. And I was afraid you'd never remember. We sat in silence. Two women, shaped by betrayal and blood, staring at the wreckage time had not healed. Do you hate me? She asked. I did, I answered. But hate is heavy, and I was tired. She closed her eyes. You won. No, I said, rising. I survived. I left before the last breath came. Some things don't need to be witnessed. Back home, Iron met me at the gate. Was she bad? He asked. She was lost, I said. And sometimes that's worse. He nodded, holding my hand tighter. In the evening, I sat beside Kale on the steps of our home. The stars above us blinked, silent witnesses to the woman I once was and the one I had become. I buried the girl they loved, I said. And gave birth to the woman you are, Kale replied. Together, we watched the dark without fear. And I knew. This was not an ending. This was a beginning written in ash and blood. And finally, in love. Spring melted into summer, and life moved like a stream, gentle, clear, but deeper than it appeared. Iron learned to write his name beneath the old oak tree, his small fingers pressing each letter into parchment with pride. Kale carved a bench for us there, and on days when the sky softened into gold, we sat beneath that tree, listening to the breeze speak through the leaves. Yet not all winds bring peace. One morning, a stranger came to the village, cloaked in merchant colors, but carrying himself with too much precision. His questions were too careful, his gaze too sharp. He asked about the woman who ran the house for the voiceless, the woman who healed the broken, the woman who once was betrayed. He did not find me, but I found him. That night, I entered his rented room through the back, quiet, barefooted, shadowbound. He reached for a blade the moment he turned, but I had mine to his throat first. Who sent you? I asked. He smiled. It wasn't cruel. It was sad. A mother, dying. A brother, lost. A family torn. They sent me to ask, who are you really? I am what they made me, I said. And what they feared I'd become. He lowered his hands. The boy you spared, he remembers. Then let him remember. The man left with no blood spilled. But I watched the trees for weeks afterward. The past has roots. And sometimes, even when you pull them out, the soil remembers. One evening, Iron brought home a wilted flower. It wanted to bloom, he said, but no one watered it. I took it from him, planted it by our steps, and tended it with care. Not because I believed it would live, but because I knew what it meant to be almost forgotten. Kale watched me with the quiet awe he always wore when I was soft. You make everything grow, he whispered once, forehead against mine. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. There were no more letters. No more rumors. Only the sound of Iron's laughter echoing through the woods. And still, sometimes, I walked to the edge of our land, where the earth dipped into a shallow ravine and the wind turned sharp. I stood there in silence, not waiting, for nothing was coming, but remembering. Remembering the girl who died. The woman who rose. And the story that would never need telling again because it had already been lived. Years passed like petals on the breeze, falling, drifting, sometimes caught by memory. Iron grew tall, with Kale's strength and my silence. He carried his childhood in the curve of his smile and the burden of his history in the quiet way he listened before speaking. He did not ask again about Alira. Not after I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to shape compassion without leaving him with my scars. He forgave her in ways I never could. Kale's hands remained steady, even as age began to whisper through the bones of our lives. We built more rooms in our home, not for necessity, but for invitation, for the weary, the voiceless, the women who came with broken feet and burning eyes. They called me mother in more than name. Some stayed. Some left with bread and warm cloaks. But all of them carried a piece of the woman I had become. In autumn, when the moon glowed like gold in the sky, Kale and I would sit beneath the stars, and he would say, "You chose vengeance once, but you built a life with grace." And I would tell him, vengeance was never the end. It was only the gate. He kissed my hand then, like he had the first time. And I would remember, not with ache, but with awe. The past never left me, but it no longer claimed me. They buried me once, Alira and Darius. They stole my child, my breath, my place in this world. They thought death was silence. But I rose. I loved again. I mothered again. I lived fully, fiercely, not as the ghost of what was stolen, but as the seed of something greater. I became the woman I needed in my first life. And that was the true vengeance. Not their ruin, but my blooming,